of spirit, of sight and sound and mind. Your radio is a cosmic doorway, and your psyche begins to spark. When you tune in to Gary and the Sun and Night Dreams After Dark.
Do you have a paranormal story you want to share on Night Dreams Talk Radio? You could be a guest. Email us at nightdreamstalkradio@gmail.com.
You're listening to Night Dreams Talk Radio After Dark with our host, Gary Anderson.
And that is me. We're talking to David. We're talking about Homicide in America. What else do you have for the listeners, Dave?
Well, I have to finish up this story about the Tampa because it actually gets worse.
Uh-oh.
They arrest this guy because he's got a big mouth, right? This guy that killed these people in Tampa. So they arrest him, and riot breaks out. They want to They want to lynch him. They sneak him out of the jail. Things get so bad they call in National Guard. Somebody starts shooting, and the National Guard opened fire with a machine gun and killed 5 rioters.
Oh, wow. So,
yeah.
That is horrible.
I know. I mean, 14 people died because of this guy. And he ended up getting an electric chair, but, man, and it was all because of a misunderstanding over a woman,
Yeah, but you know what? That's the type of woman that, needs to stay away from that type of guy.
Well, they were probably both sailors, so, I think everyone in the Pacific Northwest had a fisherman as a roommate, housemate at one time, so everyone can understand that.
Oh, yeah. Going on to other homicides and anything is interesting, anything that is scary or anything.
Well, on May 30th in 1926, in Provo, Utah, this 4-year-old kid, his name is James Brand, and he's playing with his 3-year-old brother in the backyard of his grandmother's house. Sunday afternoon, everybody's just kind of standing around. And, back in those days, everybody had hatchets laying around because they killed their own chickens, right? They had a chopping block. So James picks up this hatchet and beats his little brother over the head with it. And he had hit him over a dozen times before an adult could intervene. And the kid died. So what do you do when you have a 4-year-old ex-murderer?
What did they do that time frame?
They couldn't do anything. They took him to the hospital and examined him, and they were like, there's no, they can't put a little kid in jail and stuff. He's a little 4-year-old. So it turns out that a couple months before that, he had wandered into his neighbor's yard, and his neighbor, wanted to scare the kids, so he wouldn't come in his yard. Because, everyone had goats and stuff back then, and kids could get hurt. Back then you'd get a scratch and you'd die, from the infection. So he grabbed him and said, I was going to cut off his head on the cutting block, And it freaked out the kid so bad that he started having nightmares and started getting violent towards his schoolmates and playmates and stuff, and started hurting animals and things. But yeah, they couldn't do anything to the kid. He died of epileptic seizure in 1929, and his father, it was really bad on the family.
Yeah.
Especially because some news guy, a popular columnist named Arthur Brisbane, wrote a bit about the tragedy, and he got things wrong and said something about like the father was the one that tried to show him, scared him and stuff. And so he had it all bad.
Yeah, just think about the mental anguish it would have caused that whole family, let alone a 4-year-old. It doesn't. They don't digest what they do right or wrong at that age, and probably didn't. Right. I watched my one son. This is going back many moons ago, but one of my sons, he was probably about 5 years old, and my oldest daughter, was like 6 years old, and we were building something. And he took the hammer and like hit her over the head with it, just like whack. And, then he felt really bad because she was bleeding and crying, really,
Yeah.
But then he realized what he did wrong. But I mean, but again, at that age, they don't think about what's going to happen when they do something. They act something out and they do it.
Yeah.
So
1926 there was a lot of family murders where entire families would get killed, and it's just odd. A lot of these crimes too mostly happen out in rural areas.
Interesting. I mean, what's the most famous one that you can think of?
The most famous one that happened in 1926?
Yeah.
Well, I would say the most famous one is pretty sick too, and this guy, he was like no good. So life, he was a good old boy backslapper and stuff, but he had criminal intent all the time. He claimed that he had lost his virginity at 8 years old, and always had a story and things like that. And he was kind of a drifter. He had joined the army, and then he joined the army. He went AWOL, only to join the Navy.
Okay.
Right? And then he went AWOL in the Navy. And he had knocked up some girl and stuff, and, it was just, he'd spent some time in Leavenworth for those crimes and things, too. And he wandered. He was just a drifter, worked in oil wells and things like that. Just a guy, he'd work on boats sometimes, too. So he found out his brother died, and he lived on a farm out in Texas. He got kicked in the head by a mule, and he had like 9 kids. And so he went over there to help, get things together. But of course, him being the creep, he ended up marrying his sister-in-law. And, he was a drinker and stuff, and just, let's just say he couldn't keep his pants on. He was always BSing so much that even like people in this little town all kind of thought, well, he's a nice guy, but I think he's kind of full of it, And so the daughter, his niece, came home to visit with her husband, and it turned out that he had visited her when they were both in California. And it turns out that they had sex together, and her baby was his.
Oh, wow.
Right? So this is his brother's kid. And that all came out when he came to visit. So his wife was pretty mad, as you can imagine, and he was kind of in the doghouse, and he just ended up killing her one night, just smacking her in the head with a 2x4. Smacks this the little 2-year-old kid that's sleeping, a couple other kids that were in the house. One of the sons, some of them were grown and gone, and one of the sons was working on a farm 20 miles away or so, helping with the harvest, making some money. and he came home on the weekend, and everyone was dead. He like buried them in a crawl space, like in a root cellar next to the house. And so when the last son came home, he killed him, stuck him in the root cellar. Told the neighbors and people that he was going to have an auction off his stuff. His wife moved back to Oklahoma with all the kids, and so he was left there to sell it. Well, the sheriff was kind of curious about that. He thought, yeah, he never liked this guy. And this is like in the panhandle on the New Mexican border of Texas. It's like flat as a pancake. There's no trees or anything. So, they're having their auction. This guy in this wagon rolling by, the rear wheel of the wagon sinks down. So everyone goes to help pull the wagon up, and they could see all these bodies, the smell came out. So he got caught that way. Turns out that in 1918, when he lived in California, in Whittier, California, he was married to another woman, and they had 3 kids. And he killed all of them, too, and buried them underneath the house. So he admitted this when he was in jail. And, the small town cop in Texas had to call, Southern California and tell them about this. And sure enough, they found the bodies under the house.
That is scary. Could you imagine? There's people like that. My grandmother and grandfather, when I was a kid, they grew up on a place called Whidbey Island.
I lived there.
Yeah, and
I lived there in 1979.
Yeah, they moved to the mainland, and they rented a small house up in White Center. It was a 1-bedroom house, and ever so often, weird things were happening, paranormal things, by the way. But a stench would come and go, but it would never hang around. They lived there for a year, and then they moved out, and then the guy rented it to another person. And for some reason, they had to go underneath, the house, and there was a crawl space between the dirt and the bottom of the, flooring. And here was a blanket with chains wrapped around it. Well, it turned out the guy who was renting the house out murdered his wife and stuck her underneath the house.
Wow.
And people,
what year did that happen? You know that?
That would have had to been in the mid, I would say, actually early 60s.
Wow. Holy cow.
But think about that. I mean, some of these people, they don't think about, like, hey, why? If you're going to kill somebody and put them underneath the house, why would you rent it or sell it or anything? Because somebody someday is going to go down there and you're going to get caught.
Yeah. Ooh, people don't really think that much. When people murder, usually they're always in a frenzy and they don't think things out, or they think it out too much. So, there's always a problem left behind with that. Something like that happened in 1948 here in Sonora, out in the Sierra Nevadas. And this is in my book, California's Deadliest Women, Dangerous Dames and Murderous Moms. And that's on Craven Street Books. In 1948, there was this couple, and they were both, had grown kids and were married before and widowed, and they'd gotten married. Ada Peters Hansen and her husband Otto, and she was 41, he was 45. That was old back in those days. So they were like, she was a camp cook. There was a lot of camps out there and resorts and things like that. And he worked as a handyman or electrician, whatever he could. They were kind of living the vagabond trailer life. And, they seemed happy enough. They had saved up their money. Their plan was they were going to buy a bar in Alaska that was a friend or relatives. And he was like, hey, you come up with the money, you can buy it from me. I'm, ready. So they were saving for years. That's why they were doing those jobs in seasonal jobs and living in cheap, in trailers and cabins and stuff. So they were living in this cabin resort in the wintertime, when, they weren't busy, so people would stay there for a couple of months. So turns out that Otto blew all the money gambling.